All right, everyone, welcome to this call on the necessary shift from privacy to trust. Thank you very much, Tim Walters, for agreeing to do this. Much appreciated. Let me just hand it over to you and then we'll get started.
Okay, let me see if I can make this a slideshow. If it isn't already.
Trust is imperative.
Yeah, it might work. Okay.
We see 28 slides.
Right. So that's like 4.5 minutes for me. If you don't know me, I was at FatWire, the web content management vendor, for many years. Then I went to Forrester as a WCM analyst, and then covered a lot of other software categories while I was at Forrester. Then started a little boutique agency focused on customer experience. And since the end of 2016, I've been completely independent again, and basically working at the intersection of data privacy and customer experience. And this, the presentation is directed. I mean, when I say you, or when I say what you should be doing, you'll see that it's directed towards CX teams, and either it'll be easy for you to figure out how that advice applies to what your particular area of expertise, or better yet, I think that we can probably all agree that good customer experience, superior customer experience, is really an organizational wide responsibility. So in a sense, in a very true sense, CX team applies to everybody in the organization in one way or another. If you want to read some of the stuff that I've been publishing, although I haven't done a lot of it recently, it's at contentadvisory.net. That's a company that I'm associated with that's in California that I want. It gives me a place to publish my stuff. And secondly, I often sell my services on their paper because I'm not incorporated. And my non-incorporated company is called Zero Theory, which doesn't have a website, and as you'll see, has a logo that I created in PowerPoint using only my thumbs. So 3 forces at work in the data privacy landscape or environment. The obvious one is data protection regulations. At the beginning of last year, almost a year ago, 130 jurisdictions worldwide. Just this morning, I checked it, and a neat 999 fines have been imposed, not paid, but imposed, under a GDPR enforcement actions totaling almost 1.6 billion euros. And then in California, we have this curious case of the CCPA being replaced or amended or extended or something by what's called this California Privacy Rights Act. And that's very strange, but very instructive, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second force, what I call infrastructural restrictions, things like the deprecation of third-party cookies, the rise of tracking blockers and privacy-centric browsers. My favorite browsers are Brave and Epic, which has built-in VPNs. You can select between, I think, 9 different geographies in the U.S. that you want to claim that you're surfing from. And of course, Apple's ATT, anti-tracking, what's it called? Anti-tracking technology? App tracking technology. The last time I checked in September, about 15% of the consumers in the US and around 23% worldwide are opting in to tracking. So no more than, I mean, that means 75% plus are opting out under ATT. And speaking of consumers, that's the third force. We as consumers, probably all of you regularly, if not daily, if not hourly, have some reason to be anxious or angry about the way in which your data is being used and abused with or without your knowledge. So only 17% in the US and EU say it's even ethical to track online behavior. And in a global survey done, I think in 2019 by SAP, 80% of people globally said if they use my data without my knowledge would be a top reason for them to abandon a service provider. So what I want to encourage you all to do is focus on what I call the real GDPR, not the EU regulation, but this global data privacy revolution. And that's kind of my first takeaway. Focus on the consumers, the customers, the prospects, your constituents, what they want, expect, and demand. This real GDPR is not the sum of all regulations around the world of the 130, or probably now more like 160 plus. It is rather this cultural and social force. And in that sense, complying with or addressing, responding to the real GDPR is about customer experience. It's not about compliance. It's about satisfying consumers, not satisfying regulators. Now, of course, you need to satisfy regulators, but from a CX perspective, that shouldn't be your focus. So what should CX teams or the organization be doing now? Well, of course, you're going to be assisting with compliance in any way that you can or are asked to do so. Things like mapping data flows throughout the organization. I mean, marketers and CX are probably, in most organizations, at least most B2C organizations, the heaviest primary user of personal data within the organization. And make sure that you're keeping up to date with privacy impact analyses and privacy by design requirements, all the documentation requirements that come under the GDPR. And of course, consent management, making sure that you're getting consent legitimately, storing it correctly, and so on and so forth. And that, just to drill down on that a little bit, I think it's absolutely imperative that customer experience, people responsible for customer experience, address and eradicate what are still, if not actually user hostile, then at minimum, always, I don't think I've ever seen an exception to this rule, at minimum, cookie consent interactions, cookie consent pop-up forms are off-brand, undifferentiated, right? They just are the same stupid form, maybe with your company's logo in the corner of it. And they pop up usually at the beginning of the customer experience, of the customer's experience, the very first time they show up on a website or on an app. And so, obviously, the last thing that you want to be doing is making that crucial first impression negative or subpar. So, for example, this is actually a cookie interaction that I think is pretty good. Again, not particularly engaging and barely branded, but it wasn't so long ago, as you probably all know, I'm sure you all know, because again, you're all consumers, a year ago, maybe let's say a year and a half ago, the vast majority of cookie interactions in the EU or under the GDPR were manifestly, obviously non-compliant. And that was either due to design or due to negligence. But one way or the other, I mean, as I always said, a fifth grader who read the text of the GDPR could look at 85% of those cookie pop-up forms that we were getting in the first 2 years of the regulation and see that they didn't follow the law, right? Now they're getting a little better, because here you see there's more or less equal-sized agree and disagree, although disagree is unfortunately called more options, and agree is prominently orange rather than gray. And when you click on more options, you go over here and you see that all of the non-essential cookies are turned off by default, which of course they're required to do so, and so forth. So this is some progress. In my view, it's still not entirely compliant, but things are getting much better. One way of thinking about this, just to drill down or emphasize this need to take control of these initial cookie interactions, is imagine that you and your competitors are in the business of selling apples. So you've each got a barrel of apples at a marketplace, and consumers are stopping by and looking at your respective barrels of apples, and your barrel of apples has this rotten, desiccated apple on the top, and they have to reach behind it. If they care to interact with you and not go shop somewhere else, they have to somehow navigate beyond this rotten piece of fruit, and they're probably to just not bother navigating beyond and go to someone who doesn't have rotten apples at the top of their barrel. Data is harder to get yet it's more important than ever. So you can see the data points on the left. Accenture has called this a vicious circle because consumers desire and increasingly expect, and in fact increasingly demand, the benefits of personalization and what's called hyper relevance. But they are also withholding the data that is necessary to fuel those personalized and relevant experiences. So it's kind of a catch-22. So the third thing that I think CX team should be doing now is understanding and mastering the drivers of consent. So given that consent is so important, because consent is the way that you unlock the data that's necessary to fuel the customer experiences that are demanded by your prospects and your customers, then you have to figure out what increases consent. So one of the things you can do is what's called just-in-time consent, and this is not a great example of it, but there aren't that many in the wild yet. But the idea is simply that rather than posing the consent request as this hostile gate at the beginning of the digital experience, embed the consent request in the ongoing experience itself. So wait until the consumer is doing something that could benefit them from sharing their data, then ask them if they are willing to share it, because then they can balance, if I submit this email address, I'm going to get that benefit, rather than asking me up front, would you like to share your email address? And I don't know why you're asking me. So this is the benefit of just-in-time consent. The other thing that you can do is just ask yourself, what kinds of psychological attributes or what kinds of relationships and what kind of interactions promote consent? And here it's very, very clear, as you can see, that trust is the #1 driver of consent by a lot, right? So let me get to my text for this so I don't miss out. Right, so this is a UK survey. Interestingly, this is a survey conducted by the DMA, the Digital Marketing Association in the UK, which, if you don't know, is basically kind of like the IAB. They're a lobby for aggressive digital marketing. They're a lobby for getting consumers or eroding consumer data protection rights in order to allow people to market more efficiently. And kind of embarrassingly, I think, when they conducted this survey, they found that trust was the overwhelming response when people asked what would make you happy to share your data. No, not just willing to share, happy to share. Trust was the top response by 34% versus 13% for the second most powerful driver. It was picked a top 3 response by 54%. And note that all the way down at the bottom, if I receive relevant ads, which an organization like the DMA would constantly cite as the primary reason that consumers are happy to surrender their data, it is absolutely dead last. And only 2% gave that as a top choice why they would be happy to share their data. Similarly, and more impressive just because of its geographic reach and geographic breadth, Boston Consulting Group surveyed consumers in the US and 5 European countries. Over 70% to almost 80% said they would not allow a company that they do not trust to use their data. So the question now is, where is all this going? What does the future look like? And I think based upon these kind of survey results, the future looks like we should be reevaluating and appropriately reacting to this central, crucial, indispensable role of trust for successful customer experience. So you can look at it this way: in the so-called customer-centric era, so whenever you want to date that, say starting around 2005, companies began to slowly learn that customer experience is more important than product features and benefits. The famous Gartner data point was that already in 2016, Gartner announced on the basis of their surveys that 90% of senior executives expected their companies to compete mostly on the basis of customer experience. That's a quote, mostly on the basis. But we're now in what I call the era of beg data, beg with an E, in which access to personal data to fuel customer experiences requires the permission of the consumer. And whether that's actively opting in by the consent ground under the GDPR, or not opting out if you assert the so-called legitimate interest ground under the GDPR, you still have to present the data subjects with a very clear opportunity to opt out of collection under legitimate interest. So one way or another, you need to get permission. And since trust is the primary driver of that permission or consent, as we just saw, it becomes effectively more important than CX. That is, trust is a prerequisite for consent, which is a prerequisite for great CX. Now, there has, of course, been a lot of talk about trust in the last 2, 3, even 5 years. You can't escape if you read anything, or especially if you go to conferences, you can't escape mentions of Edelman's trust barometer and the famous or infamous crisis of trust. But what is relatively rare is taking time to reflect on just what is trust and how do you get more of it. And so in pursuit of the data necessary, or in pursuit of great CX, we need to have access to sufficient amount of data. And now we know that in order to get that data, we need to have trust. So what is trust? So here's a slightly wordy but excellent definition of trust from 2 legal scholars. I won't read all of it, but it's a state of mind that's important, that allows you to make yourself vulnerable, willing to make yourself vulnerable to another, despite the fact that their actions could harm you when you make yourself vulnerable. Or to put it quite directly, trust is a confident relationship to uncertainty, or I like to modify this to future uncertainty. It's always, trust is always about some uncertain future. You're not sure how the other is going to act, and yet you place yourselves in their hands, so to speak, regardless of that risk. So now the question becomes, how do you build trust? How do you get more trust? And the disturbing but surprising answer is you cannot. You can't build trust. So this is the philosopher Honora O'Neill. Trust is distinctive because it's given to you by other people. You can't build or rebuild what other people give you. All you can do, what you can do, is give them the basis for giving you their trust. And the obvious question is, what is that basis? What makes you worthy of trust? I see a hand in the back. Yes, you're right. Trustworthiness makes you worthy of trust. You cannot create trust any more than you can make someone love you. If you want to be loved, be lovable. If you want to increase trust, be trustworthy. That is, persistently and consistently demonstrate, communicate, radiate that you are trustworthy. So now the question has become suddenly, what is trustworthiness, and how do we get more of that, or how do we demonstrate trustworthiness? And the typical attributes there, you can come up with different attributes of trustworthiness, but they're things like integrity, reliability, empathy, fairness, consistency, and so forth. And by widespread agreement, they fall in kind of neatly, conveniently into these 2 buckets or categories: ethical attributes like integrity and empathy, and competence attributes like capability and consistency. And this is in fact how Edelman characterizes trustworthiness in their global trust surveys. So how should the organization, or rather how your organization should go about demonstrating trustworthiness, is going to depend on many, many factors, including the results of what I call a trustworthiness assessment. Maybe we can talk about that. It'll depend upon what attributes you want to prioritize for improvement. But given these 2 main buckets, ethics and competence, there are 2 scenarios that I think will apply to virtually any kind of firm. And let's look at those very quickly. The first is, again, demonstrating ethics, demonstrating that you are ethical in consent practices. We've looked at, how consent can go awry with bad and manipulative cookie forms. So let's just add here, manipulation and deceitful interactions may or may not be compliant. They're pretty much by definition not compliant. They may or may not deliver more data. Maybe they will, and you'll just think, well, let's keep this up until the DPA tells us not to. But from the perspective of trust, those manipulative and deceitful interactions are actively communicating to every consumer that interacts with them that you are not trustworthy, that you do not want to help them achieve their goals. The second broad, so again, I won't look at all the data here. Well, actually, this was kind of interesting. PwC's survey, globally, 32% said they would stop doing business with a brand they loved, not just a brand they loved, like Apple, after one bad experience. And in Latin America, it was almost half of all consumers who said that. So this is what I call this customer experience dilemma. Consumers demand and reward ever richer, more relevant, and more engaging experiences, which are necessarily more complicated, more complex, more intricate. And yet one tiny misalignment in that complex machinery may not only diminish the experience, but could mean that the consumer, the customer, or the prospect walks away from you forever. And this is why I think that the metaphor of orchestration is so appropriate for customer experience, or why, in a certain way, it's not a metaphor. It's just true. It's descriptive. Because creating good customer experiences is about bringing together many disparate inputs, the results of which, if poorly managed, if you've ever heard a bad orchestra, can be just cacophony and chaos, and it hurts your ears. But when done right, each element contributes in precisely the right measure to produce a symphonic whole that is far greater than the sum of the individual parts. And of course, this orchestration is not just about data, but again, this kind of drives home my initial point about how the entire organization is involved. People, processes, technologies, you could think of those in terms of the musicians in the orchestra, the conductor, and the sheet music, right? However you want to allocate those three elements. What's clear is that those three need to work in harmony. So let me wrap it up. Lack of trust means less access to personal data, which means you build impoverished customer experiences, which means you're at a competitive disadvantage, which means all kinds of sadness for your company and your team and potentially your career. But getting more trust, it's not a commodity that can be created at will. It can't be purchased like a resource. It can't be manufactured like a product. It can't be secured by simply clever marketing campaigns and Super Bowl ads. Trust must be earned. If you know the John Houseman commercials from the 1970s, I say earned. And the only way it can be earned, the only way is by being trustworthy, by embodying, demonstrating, communicating, projecting trustworthiness. So going back to our two buckets of trustworthy attributes, organizations that acquire personal data ethically and respectfully and orchestrate it competently and consistently for great CX, for great customer experiences, will win this ongoing battle for consumer trust. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Tim. And unbelievably, you made it on time. We still have actually room for a question or two. I can jump in there, but if anybody else wants to, feel free to just jump in. All right, in the chat. I've already promised your slides away, Tim. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
The one thing I would ask, and I think that goes for perhaps 2 or 3 in this audience who saw you in person pre-COVID, so that's like in a different lifetime, but you spoke about this topic at our conference in 2019.
Right.
And you had on the opening slide, if I turn my notes here, that some fines have been issued since then.
Mm-hmm.
But what would you say? Like, I know some people in the community say GDPR was a disappointment because
Mm-hmm.
it's broken the web with all these cookie banners. Any big kind of eye-opening things from your side in the last 2 years when it comes to privacy and the impact of GDPR and other regulation?
Yeah, let me see if I've got a data point here.
You know,
I mean,
if not you
on the
were
one,
like saying this is the Armageddon of the CX, you know?
yeah, on the one thing to say is that the enforcement actions and the fines have been ramping up very, very quickly. So I think if I've got it here, I think I wrote it down. In the first 12 months after the GDPR came into effect, so May 2018 to May 2019, there were 48 fines for about 50 million euros. Just in the last in the 6 months between May of 2021 and October of 2021, there were 150 fines, 3 times as many in 6 months, for over 1 billion euros. So one, the DPAs are getting better at enforcement. Nevertheless, I don't think that if you're the kind of organization that wants to get away with non-compliant actions, you don't have that much to fear because the DPAs are so far from competent, realistic enforcement that they've got a long, long ways to go before they're tracking down everybody who's non-compliant. But the second thing I would say is, again, my early point. It doesn't matter because you're not trying to satisfy the regulators. From a customer experience perspective, you're not trying to satisfy the regulators. You're trying to satisfy consumers. And they are clearly, demonstrably, only getting more and more upset. This is something I actually forgot to say. What's instructive about the CCPA and the CPRA? So you may know the CCPA, the California, is it Consumer Privacy Act or Citizens Privacy Act? I think it's Consumer Privacy Act. Started out as a ballot measure in California. You know, in California, it's really easy, not easy, but popular to do a citizens ballot measure, and you get something put onto the ballot and you can vote on it. And they vary. This happened just as the Cambridge Analytica things were breaking. And so the organizers said when they were trying to gather whatever 500,000 signatures or 1 million signatures that they needed to get this thing on the ballot, all they had to do was hold up a pen and their clipboard and say Cambridge Analytica, and people would grab the pen and sign, right? So they very quickly got the signatures, and it very quickly also from surveys became evident that this thing was going to pass, very likely to pass when it came on the ballot in 2016, in November of 2016. And that's when the data giants in California went to the legislators in the legislature and said, we've got to do something about this. Let's pass a bill, right? That we can influence, that we can shape, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what they did. And the organizers agreed to that. The organizers of the CCPA, or the organizers of the ballot measure, agreed that they would go along with this. And that's where the CCPA came from. And I said at the time, I wasn't the only one by far, that if consumers, if organizers, right, not only the organizers, but if all of those consumers who signed that ballot measure, signed up for the ballot measure in the first place, if they think or sense that the CCPA has been watered down too much, what are they going to do? They're going to have another ballot measure, right? They've demonstrated that they are willing to take action. And that's exactly what happened. So the CPRA, the California Privacy Rights Act, is meant to, it doesn't replace the CCPA, it modifies it, it amends it, right? It amends it. And it's meant to fill in what the organizers perceived as holes or gaps or errors in the formulation of the original CCPA. What's instructive about all of this story is that both the original CCPA and the CPRA are more or less directly expressions of the voice of the people. Some bureaucrat in Sacramento didn't say, you know what, I think we should drop a privacy regulation. Citizens drew up the privacy regulation and said, as in the famous network film, what do they say? I'm pissed off and I'm not going to take it anymore. Whatever they say before they throw their television out the window, right?
Thank
And
you,
so
Tim.
that's the force of this of what I call the real GDPR.
Very good. And that's all we had. On that happy note, big round of applause for Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Much appreciated.